JFK had no intention of ending the war in Vietnam, despite claims of his associates and pointing to National Security Action Memorandum 263. His plan of U.S. withdrawal was always contingent upon victory. If there was no faith in the South Vietnamese government, American troops were there to stay. South Vietnam had to be in a position where they were guaranteed to defeat the Northern military forces for U.S. troops to withdraw from the conflict. During John's presidency, he and Robert Kennedy continuously reiterated the desire to see the war through until victory against North Vietnam was achieved. In 1956, while still a senator, he said, "Vietnam represents the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia, the keystone to the arch, the finger in the dike. Burma, Thailand, India, Japan, the Philippines, and, obviously, Laos and Cambodia are among those whose security would be threatened if the red tide of communism overflowed into Vietnam. Moreover, the independence of free Vietnam is crucial to the free world in fields other than the military. Her economy is essential to the economy of all of Southeast Asia, and her political liberty is an inspiration to those seeking to obtain or maintain their liberty in all parts of Asia, and indeed the world. The fundamental tenets of this nation's foreign policy, in short, depend in considerable measure upon a strong and free Vietnamese nation." On July 17, 1963, he stated, "For us to withdraw from that effort would mean a collapse not only of South Vietnam, but Southeast Asia, so we are going to stay there." Then, in an interview with Walter Cronkite on September 2nd, he said, "I don't agree with those who say we should withdraw. That would be a great mistake. It doesn't do us any good to say, well, why don't we all just go home and leave the world to those who are our enemies? We are going to meet our responsibility." He reiterated his stance in a September 9th interview. "What I am concerned about is that Americans will get impatient and say because they don't like events in Southeast Asia or they don't like the government in Saigon that we should withdraw. That only makes it easy for the communists. I think we should stay. We should use our influence in as effective a way as we can, but we should not withdraw." Then on September 12th, he said, "We want the war to be won, the communists to be contained, and the Americans to go home. But we are not there to see a war lost, and we will follow the policy which I have indicated today of advancing those causes and issues which help win the war." On September 26, Kennedy said, "I know that there are many of you who sit here and wonder what it is that causes the United States to go so far away, that causes you to wonder why so many of your sons should be stationed so far away from our own territory, who wonder why it is since 1945 that the United States has assisted so many countries. You must wonder when it is all going to end and when we can come back home. Well, it isn't going to end, and this generation of Americans has to make up its mind for our security and for our peace, because what happens in Europe or Latin America or Africa or Asia directly affects the security of the people who live in this city, and particularly those who are coming after. I make no apologies for the effort that we make to assist these other countries to maintain their freedom, because I know full well that every time a country, regardless of how far away it may be from our own borders, every time that country passes behind the Iron Curtain, the security of the United States is thereby endangered. So all those who suggest we withdraw, all those who suggest we should no longer ship our surplus food abroad or assist other countries, I could not disagree with them more. If the United States were to falter, the whole world, in my opinion, would inevitably begin to move toward the communist bloc. So when you ask why we are in Laos or Vietnam or the Congo, or why do we support the Alliance for Progress in Latin America, we do so because we believe that our freedom is tied up with theirs, and if we can develop a world in which all the countries are free, then the threat to the security of the United States is lessened. So we have to stay at it. We must not be fatigued." Kennedy supported the overthrow of Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, the leaders of the South Vietnamese government. They had minimal support in South Vietnam, and they resorted to paramilitary units to attempt to maintain power while communist support rose. Buddhists protested the persecution the government subjected them to by self-immolation. When they requested that America withdraw so they could reach a settlement with North Vietnam, Kennedy decided they could no longer remain in power. Kennedy pressed for their removal and fully supported the CIA-backed coup. He told Henry Cabot Lodge, ambassador to Saigon, that it was in the interest of the U.S. government that it should succeed. The Diem brothers were killed on November 1st, and Kennedy said on November 14th, "Because we do have a new situation there and a new government, we hope an increased effort in the war." He also mentioned that it is a goal to bring Americans home, but he goes on to say that it is his administration's object to permit the South Vietnamese to maintain themselves as a free and independent country and permit democratic forces within the country to operate, which they can, of course, much more freely when the assault from the inside, and which is manipulated from the north, is ended. On November 22nd, shortly before he was assassinated, he gave a speech at Fort Worth and said that without the United States, South Vietnam would collapse overnight. The speech that Kennedy was supposed to deliver to the Trade Mart on the day of his death shows that he never strayed from his objective of victory in Vietnam. About 70% of our military assistance goes to 9 key countries located on or near the borders of the Communist bloc. 9 countries confronted directly or indirectly with the threat of communist aggression: Vietnam, Free China, Korea, India, Pakistan, Thailand, Greece, Turkey, and Iran. No one of these countries possesses on its own the resources to maintain the forces which our own chiefs of staff think needed in the common interest. Reducing our efforts to train, equip, and assist their armies can only encourage communist penetration and require in time the increased overseas deployment of American combat forces, and reducing the economic help needed to bolster these nations that undertake to help defend freedom can have the same disastrous result. In short, the $50 billion we spend each year on our own defense could well be ineffective without the $4 billion required for military and economic assistance. Kennedy's Vietnam record is one of continuous support. By the end of 1961, he had boosted the number of U.S. military advisors there from fewer than 700 to roughly 3,000, and the figure was to climb to 16,000 during the 2 years to come. He furnished the South Vietnamese government with helicopters and fighter aircraft and the pilots to fly them. At his death, annual U.S. aid to the Saigon regime was running at $500 million. As a young congressman, he had voted to fund the French in their war, asserting that the United States had to block the onrushing tide of communism from engulfing Asia. He later described U.S. backing for the anti-communist regime of Ngo Dinh Diem in Saigon as a test of American responsibility and determination. His disciples contend that he afterward became more sophisticated and less dogmatic. But not long before his assassination, he still clung to the domino theory, which envisioned communism toppling one region after another like a row of dominoes. Or as he told a television interviewer in September 1963, if South Vietnam went, it would give the impression that the wave of the future in Southeast Asia was China and the communists. We must persist. Robert Kennedy, when he was interviewed by John Barlow Martin after the assassination, further reaffirmed his brother's commitment to victory. But the president was convinced that we had to stay in there? Yes. And we couldn't lose it? Yes. And if the Vietnamese were about to lose it, would he propose to go in on land if he had to? We'd face that when we came to it. NSAM 263 is considered by some to be a smoking gun in confirming their theory that JFK would end the Vietnam War in his second term. The memo, written by McGeorge Bundy and dated October 11, 1963, concerned the withdrawal of 1,000 U.S. personnel from Vietnam, a plan which the president apparently agreed with. Specifically, it was in reference to Section 1B of the McNamara-Taylor Report. The section reads, "We recommend that General Harkins review with Diem the military charges necessary to complete the military campaign in the northern and central areas, 1, 2, and 3 Corps, by the end of 1964, and in the Delta 4 Corps by the end of 1965. This review would consider the need for such changes as a further shift of military emphasis and strength to the Delta 4 Corps, an increase in the military tempo in all Corps areas so that all combat troops are in the field an average of 20 days out of 30 and static missions are ended. Emphasis on clear and hold operations instead of terrain sweeps which have little permanent value. the expansion of personnel and combat units to full authorized strength, the training and arming of Hamlet militia to an accelerated rate, especially in the Delta, a consolidation of the strategic Hamlet program, especially in the Delta, and action to ensure that future strategic hamlets are not built until they can be protected and until civic action programs can be introduced. A program be established to train Vietnamese so that essential functions now performed by U.S. military personnel can be carried out by Vietnamese by the end of 1965. It should be possible to withdraw the bulk of U.S. personnel by that time. In accordance with the program to train progressively Vietnamese to take over military functions, the Defense Department should announce in the very near future presently prepared plans to withdraw 1,000 U.S. military personnel by the end of 1963. This action should be explained in low key as an initial step in a long-term program to replace U.S. personnel with trained Vietnamese without impairment of the war effort. For one, nowhere in this document does it claim that there were plans for the U.S. to completely pull out of the war, but only to withdraw the bulk of U.S. personnel by 1965. Further, the long-term program to replace U.S. personnel with trained Vietnamese without impairment to the war effort mentioned does not imply that the U.S. will no longer have involvement in the war and all U.S. personnel will be replaced, but only the bulk, as stated above. The President did not even want to withdraw troops in 1963, because if we were not able to take this action by the end of this year, we would be accused of being over-optimistic. The reduction of 1,000 personnel did occur that year, but, as the anonymous authors of the Pentagon Papers note, the reduction was essentially an accounting exercise, partly calculated to demonstrate that progress was being made in the war. Many of the men were pulled out under routine rotation procedures, or for medical or administrative reasons. They were replaced by others so that the force ceiling had hardly changed by the end of the year. Another purpose of NSAM 263 was for Diem to feel intimidated to become more militant in the war. Robert Kennedy said on February 18, 1962, "We are going to win Vietnam. We will remain here until we do win." According to Stanley Carnow, nobody was closer to Jack Kennedy than his brother Robert. At a White House meeting in September 1963, he had wondered aloud whether a communist takeover could be successfully resisted with any government in Saigon, and he went on to muse that perhaps now was the time to get out of Vietnam entirely. But as Arthur Schlesinger recalled, the notion hovered for a moment, then died away, a hopelessly alien thought in a field of unexamined assumptions and entrenched convictions. Robert Kennedy continued to publicly assert that America could not withdraw from Vietnam until 1967, when the war grew unpopular enough for him to come out in support of the anti-war movement during his presidential bid. His public support of the war began to shift in February 1966 when he expressed his desire for a negotiated settlement, not including withdrawal. Even when the war was ramped up, he was unwilling to allow withdrawal. In May 1965, 3 months after the bombing of South Vietnam had been vastly intensified along with the first regular bombing of the North, and after U.S. combat forces had landed, RFK condemned withdrawal as a repudiation of commitments undertaken and confirmed by 3 administrations, which would gravely, perhaps irreparably, weaken the democratic position in Asia. As Lyndon Johnson's presidency progressed, his and Kennedy's advisors, who were initially adamant on South Vietnam ultimately having to win the war with their own strength, changed their tune as it became clear they were receiving faulty intel and the projected time frame for withdrawal was unreasonable. Now that the Diem brothers were gone, full-blown unregulated U.S. military intervention could be implemented. When the war was ramped up in 1965, Johnson was only following the advice of Kennedy advisors. There is no evidence that Kennedy would have done differently than Johnson, because both followed the policy of no complete withdrawal without victory. Johnson even expressed hesitancy about escalating the war. As Noam Chomsky writes, LBJ uneasily dragged his feet. In a meeting with the Joint Chiefs on March 4, 1964, he made it clear that he does not want to lose South Vietnam before next November, nor does he want to get the country into war. Taylor Memorandum. On March 17th, he rejected the JCS request for putting in more U.S. forces and refused to authorize even reconnaissance over North Vietnam. Even after the Gulf of Tonkin incident on August 2nd, Johnson did not rush to escalation, limiting further involvement to naval patrols in the area. After another Gulf of Tonkin incident scenario in September, he was very skeptical about the evidence and refused to respond with increased retaliation. On September 25th, he said, "We don't want our American boys to do the fighting for Asian boys." It was only because he felt that he must follow JFK's policy that he stayed in Vietnam, and only as the situation seemed hopeless at the current level of involvement would he commit to his troop surge. Kenneth O'Donnell and Senator Mike Mansfield made claims that JFK told them he was going to withdraw regardless of whether victory was achieved, but this does not stand up to the historical record. Kennedy may have told them that he would withdraw, yet this does not mean he would actually do it. He was a politician after all, and lying was second nature to him. The war was not popular, and portraying himself to the right people as wanting to end it was him simply being politically savvy. Summarizing Kennedy's Vietnam policy, Chomsky writes, "By the late Eisenhower years, the vicious repression of the regime the United States imposed on South Vietnam in violation of the Geneva Agreements of 1954, which the United States rejected, had finally elicited indigenous resistance, which the regime was unable to contain. Kennedy therefore sharply escalated the U.S. intervention to direct aggression with extreme brutality, directing U.S. Air Force attacks under South Vietnamese markings, authorizing napalm and chemical warfare to destroy crops and livestock, initiating population removal to virtual concentration camps where the population was protected from the guerrillas that U.S. intelligence and province advisors knew they were mostly supporting." The most obvious argument against JFK being murdered for desiring to withdraw from Vietnam lies with Richard Nixon. Why was he not assassinated? U.S. troops were withdrawn by the time Nixon resigned. Robert Kennedy spoke of ending the war during his presidential bid, yet why was he assassinated when Nixon was saying the same thing? Therefore, there must have been another political reason for the Kennedy assassinations.